play me talking.
And you will be listening to it in the lecture. From next week, you'll be expected to have listened to the lecture primer before you come to the lecture and to have thought about the questions that are asked at the end. This is important as we will be discussing these questions in the beginning of the lecture. Now, today we're going to think about the nature of social kinds. In order to understand the nature of social kinds, we first have to think about the nature of kinds, and in order to understand kinds, we first have to think about the nature of things. For any of you who recall doing a lecture with me last year as part of the Philosophy of the Contemporary World lecture series, this might not be totally new. So, first let's think about things. Imagine that on the table in front of you are three things: a silver nugget, a silver ring, and a silver penny. Think of these as particular things, actual objects in the world. Now, when you think about these things, you can class them together. You can group them together as a kind. They are all silver things. So this particular nugget is a thing, but together they are silver things, and silver things is a kind. Obviously, there are lots of different ways that we could group things together. For example, I might talk about the objects that I decided to use as examples on this slide for social philosophy in 2019. However, it seems like not every way of grouping things is equal. Do we even really want to say that kind of thing that each of these things are objects that Joseph decided to use as examples on a slide for social philosophy in 2019? You might think not. You might think that these aren't even real kinds at all. Real kinds, you might want to say, are something like natural kinds. So when we think about silver and think about calling these silver things, you might think that's a natural grouping. Now, what is a natural kind? Well, to say that a kind is natural is to say that it corresponds to a grouping that reflects the structure of the natural world rather than the interests and actions of human beings. Or that's the definition that's given in the SEP entry on natural kinds. In fact, there's quite a lot of debate about exactly how we should understand natural kinds, but for the moment this will do. Now, a position that many people take about natural kinds is called realism. Realism about natural kinds claims that there is a genuine metaphysical difference between natural classifications and non-natural classifications. So, between the classification of those objects as silver things and the classification of those objects as objects that Joseph has chosen as examples for his slide in 2019. We might want to say that natural kinds are real. We might want to be realists about natural kinds. So, we might think there's a genuine metaphysical difference between that kind of classification, like silver, and the non-natural classification, like things Joseph has chosen as examples in his slide in 2019. There are various ways we might kind of understand exactly how this works. We might say that there's just kind of natural versus unnatural ways of grouping things together, or we might say that they share in being instances of some kind of universal, or we might say they share in having a common essence. These are all metaphysical positions we might take, but here, for now, we don't need to make a decision about exactly how we understand natural kinds, as long as we can get a grasp on this idea that they are that there's a difference between natural classifications and non-natural classifications. We might think that talking about natural classifications and non-natural classifications doesn't exhaust all the kinds of things that there are. So, as well as what we might call arbitrary kinds and natural kinds, perhaps there are social kinds as well. So, what are social kinds? Unfortunately, it's hard to give a definitional answer to this question without making metaphysical commitments about the nature of social kinds. We are going to try and make those metaphysical commitments as the module goes on, but for now, we don't want to kind of prejudge them. We might get an initial idea by giving what you might call an ostensive definition. That is by pointing at some examples and saying, these are the kind of things we're thinking about. So, what kinds of kinds are there? Social kinds, we might say, are stuff like kings, universities, firefighters, economies, heretics, student unions, French people, pelotons, cycling pelotons, etc. Where, when we say etc., that's supposed to indicate that the person listening has got a grasp of what the examples we're given and could continue the list. That's not to say that it's necessarily that easy to give such a list. As Brian Epstein notes in the reading that you would have done for this week, even cases that would seem straightforward can be contentious. A crowd, for instance, was regarded by many in the late 19th century as paradigmatic social object, but in recent years it's become less obvious that it is so. Margaret Gilbert, for instance, hesitates to attribute sociality to crowds. Sociality, she argues, arises from norms and commitments which crowds may lack. The point I want you to take from this here is that once we have formed a metaphysical view of what social kinds consist in, we might go back and revise our list. Nevertheless, I think it's still beneficial for us to start with such a list. If we came up with a metaphysical account of social kinds that matched none of the things that we naturally thought were social, you might wonder whether we've really described the social at all. Okay, so the questions I want to end on are these. Firstly, I want you to try and think of examples of some kinds that, for you, it seems are obviously social. Secondly, come up with some examples you think are obviously not social. Now, if you can, try and give some idea of what you might think the principles that explain the differences between A and B might be. Lastly, try and think of some examples that you're unsure of.